Eddie Canestracci here. Some of you might be new Kate Bush fans, and I'm here to help you out a little bit. Yeah, that's right. I was reading up on this whole Stranger Things sensation that she's been causing. It's a big news story this week that her classic 1985 song has re-entered the charts. It's like in the top 10, and that's in the US pop Billboard charts. It's in the top 10, and around the world it's a sensation again, this song. Actually bigger than it was even in the 80s, and in the 80s it was her biggest hit, but now it's like even bigger than it was then. And this is really an amazing thing to happen for an older artist, an old song. A lot of people are comparing it to when Bohemian Rhapsody, Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, became a hit again in the early 90s thanks to Wayne's World. Well, now thanks to Stranger Things, a lot of people are connecting with this song and being introduced to Kate Bush, a whole new generation, and even some older people perhaps that for whatever reason never really got into Kate Bush. And I understand why, because she's an acquired taste, especially maybe not this song that everyone's been getting into. It's a very accessible, awesome pop song, but once you start diving deeper into Kate Bush, you'll find that even though she does have other poppy and accessible songs like Running Up That Hill, there's a lot of experimental stuff, a lot of different styles, and a lot of stuff that a lot of people are just going to have trouble getting into, at least initially. I know this for a fact because I was such a person. And the funny thing is, I was planning to do a Kate Bush video like a few months from now. I was going to do like a Kate Bush rankorama. I do these ranking videos, and I was going to do a Kate Bush rankorama. I was planning to do it around wintertime. I thought wintertime was a good time to do a Kate Bush rankorama. But because of this news story, because of the sensation she's been causing this week, I thought, you know what, I'm going to fast track this. Because if I'm going to do this video, I might as well do it now. I might as well do it this week while there's a lot of people looking into Kate Bush and wanting to know where should they go in her discography. I have an idea where they're all going immediately, and that's definitely the best album for them to start with, and I'm referring to the album that this song, Running Up That Hill, is on, Hounds of Love, 1985's Hounds of Love. And yes, this is the perfect gateway album for new fans. It's my favorite album of hers, and I think it's her best. It's a great album to start with, not just because I think it's one of her most accessible, and she did poppier albums than this actually, subsequently. But to me, this is the perfect balance of pop accessibility and daring experimentation, especially in the second half, where it gets very experimental. If you love stuff like David Bowie, Peter Gabriel, well, Kate Bush is like the female equivalent of those two artists. Also, I'd say Prince, not obviously on the funkier side, but Prince is more experimental, kind of psychedelic pop period in the mid-'80s. If you like stuff like Around the World in a Day and Sign of the Times. And I'm a big Prince fan. I did a couple Prince videos too. And Prince collaborated with her on a song as well. If you like stuff like that, if you like stuff that kind of straddles the line between pop and experimentation, well, Hounds of Love, you're going to love it. You're going to love it. It's a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest albums ever recorded, in my opinion. Of course, it's got Running Up That Hill. It's the first track, so right out of the gate, Running Up That Hill, in parentheses, A Deal with God. Cloud Bursting, more on that in a bit, is also another song and video, probably the second most known song from this album. There's the title track, Hounds of Love, The Big Sky, all great songs. And like I said, the first half of the album is pretty much the pop stuff, but this is like pop with an experimental edge and a lot of emotion and depth and amazing singing. But the second half is where it gets really experimental. This is the thing. So I'll tell you my story with Kate Bush and how I was introduced to this album and her music. I had heard about Kate Bush when I was a teenager. I saw like maybe a video of hers or two on like 120 Minutes on MTV. I could like hear that it was good music, but it was a little too adult for me and a little too sophisticated, and not really the kind of stuff I was listening to as a teenager. I could tell that she was a talented, beautiful woman and making music of substance, but like a little too much substance for me at that age. Flash forward to me, I would say probably in my 20s, maybe mid to late 20s, and I was watching VH1 Classic. It was the video for Cloud Bursting. I saw the video for Cloud Bursting. Great video, awesome video, directed by Terry Gilliam. The actor Donald Sutherland played a part in it. It was a very cinematic video, and it told a very compelling story. And the song was great. I love the song. And by this point, my taste in music had become more eclectic and more sophisticated, I guess you can say. So suddenly, I had a taste for this kind of music, and I love like the strings, the synth strings, which reminded me of the Gazella theme, and I was a big Gazella fan, so I was like, oh, that's cool. So I liked it, and I was like, yeah, now I was ready for some Kate Bush. So of course I went to that album, this album, Hounds of Love, and I loved the first half. And I recall when I heard the song that's a sensation around the world, when I heard Running Up That Hill, I immediately loved it. And I also recalled like hearing that when I was a child in the 80s, like I don't know, when I was out like in a shopping mall or something. I just recalled like it's like, oh, I remember this song from my childhood. It was a great song. I loved it. I loved all the tracks on the first side. I gotta tell you, even though I was starting to get into some new wave and more experimental stuff, I was not totally down the rabbit hole yet. So that second half of this album, I was like, this is too weird for me. I can't really get into it. Like I can hear it's cool, but it's a little too artsy, not really for me. So I sampled the album that was right before it. I sampled The Dreaming, and I was like, oh my God. Now that was an album all of very highly experimental music. And I was just like, not into this. And then I was thinking, well, maybe I just like a couple songs from Kate Bush. Maybe I'm not a big Kate Bush fan. And, I was reading up on the internet. A lot of people praised her first album, The Kick Inside. So I went for it. I said, okay, let's try her 70s stuff. Let's see what I think of that. So I bought The Kick Inside, and I could hear it was good music. I can hear that, she was a really good songwriter, but it was a little too twee for me. It was a little too twee, and her voice, especially her early voice here on The Kick Inside, it was a little too high pitched and a little too cartoonish for me. I just couldn't get into it. It was just too much. It was too much. I just couldn't get into it. And I was just like, okay, I like half of one of her albums. I like the first half of Hounds of Love. And I guess that's really it. So maybe I'm not a big Kate Bush fan. And I just let it go. I did get a jump on this bandwagon by 2 years. 2 years ago, it was actually right when the pandemic hit. And we were under lockdown. I was in Florida at the time. That's where I'm at right now. And even Florida was locked down then. Everybody was locking down. It was like when the pandemic was hitting. So I was home a lot, and I started making a lot of videos. That's when this channel really kind of kicked into gear, when I started making a lot of videos. And this was a very highly explorative, highly adventurous time period for me musically. I think it's because psychologically, I was like trapped in a condo. So it was like I couldn't travel physically. So I wanted to kind of travel musically. So I suddenly opened my mind up to certain artists that I hadn't really ever gotten into, or were a little bit too experimental for me. Frank Zappa is one of them. I got really into Frank Zappa, and I decided to really get into Kate Bush. I suddenly really loved that second side, Hounds of Love. Like I suddenly really got into it, and God, it's so amazing. Especially Waking the Witch, it's so creepy. It's really creepy, and really loved that. And The Morning Fog is atmospheric and beautiful. And suddenly this whole album became complete for me. And there was something also about Kate Bush and her singing that I found was very reassuring during that time period. She just radiates goodness. She's like the bright and beautiful queen fairy of the universe coming down and helping us. I just really connected with the album. And so I said, fuck it, I'm doing the deep dive. So I did the deep dive. Suddenly it clicked. Suddenly her music clicked for me. Even the first album, suddenly I liked her singing, even her earlier singing. I do prefer her singing in the mid-'80s when she started to sing with a lower range, and it's not quite as over the top as her earlier singing. I definitely do prefer her 80s singing. But I can get into her earlier late 70s singing as well. And the album that really clicked for me, so this is the album I'm going to recommend you listen to after Hounds of Love, because I feel like if I listened to this album instead of The Dreaming or The Kick Inside, I feel like this album would have been a better second album for me to go to after the Hounds of Love. And that is from 1980, Never Forever. Masterpiece. I love this album. Another masterpiece. To me, this is her second best album. Maybe objectively her best album. I don't know. It gives Hounds a run for its money. It's definitely my second favorite album of hers. And this was the album that really got me into Kate Bush. And this album is catchy, experimental, it's everything. From the first track, Babushka to the last track, Breathing, my favorite song on the album, Breathing, amazing song. It's this journey. And if you like experimental, like mid-60s, the Beatles, if you like Pepper, Mystery Tour era Beatles, if you like Peter Gabriel, if you like David Bowie, if you like stuff like pop rock, that's experimental, then this should be up your alley. Unless you got some hang up about women singers, this should be up your alley. There's even a rocking song, Violin, which is really rocking. I really like that song. And this whole album's great. I love every song on it. It's what got me really, really into Kate Bush. Since it worked for me, I think it might work for you. After you listen to Hounds of Love, get Never Forever. I also think it's the album that's a transition album. So it kind of transitions her 70s style into the 80s style. So I think it's a good album to kind of transition into the 70s from, rather than jump to her first album, in my opinion. Then, after you get this album, if you love it, okay, then you can work backwards. You could kind of go for either of the next two albums. I guess most people like The Kick Inside, her first album, which I talked about earlier. So I guess go to The Kick Inside. I prefer her second album, which I'll get into after this. But The Kick Inside has a lot of her classics. This was a big hit in England. Didn't do much in America. But in England, it was a huge hit. It was her debut album. She was this teenage prodigy discovered by David Gilmour. That's right, David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. If you didn't know that, there you go. Rock fans, that should make her seem a little more legit to you. Great album. Every song is a very well-written song. It's got Wuthering Heights, The Man with the Child in His Eyes, James and the Cold Gun. That's a great swaggering kind of rock tune. Shows that she could apply her very unique vocal stylings to different kinds of music. My favorite song is probably another single in the UK, Them Heavy People. Love Them Heavy People. A little funky, fun, playful song. And that's the thing about a lot of Kate Bush stuff. It just makes you feel good. It's playful. It's fun. There's humor. But yet it's also romantic and sensual and serious all at the same time, much like life. This is a really strong album. That being said, my personal taste, I would rank it about, it's my fifth favorite Kate Bush album. She's very young on it, and it's a little try hard. Now, she's succeeding. She's trying hard and succeeding, but she's very young and showy on it. And a lot of people think her next album, also the same year, 1978, Lionheart, they think it suffers from the sophomore slump. I've heard people say that, and they don't think it's quite as strong as the first album. I kind of get why people think that, but I disagree. I actually like this album better. This is my fourth favorite Kate Bush album. I think the reason why people kind of think it has the sophomore slump is because, A, it came out quickly after the first album, so psychologically they think it's rushed, but I don't think it's rushed. I mean, that's actually how a lot of bands used to do it back in the old days. You know, a lot of artists used to release 2 albums a year. Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath both released 2 of their best albums, their first 2 albums, in 1 year. That's how artists used to do it. And I think, Kate Bush is, she's a real artist. She just went back in the studio filled with a lot of inspiration. And I'm sure half these songs she probably already had written already. But the reason why I like this album a little bit better, it's a little more subtle, which is probably why people don't like it as much as the first one. It's a little more subtle, it's a little more mature, and it's a little bit darker. It's a little bit darker, which is why I like it. It's a little more mature, it's a little darker. To me, it is a step in the direction of Never Forever, but it's like a subtle step in that direction. It's a great album. I really love this, and it does have a few songs that even if some of the stuff is a little too subtle for you, there are some standouts, like the first track, Symphony and Blues, a really catchy song. The biggest hit from the album, I think, in England, Wow. That's the name of the song, Wow. And Wow. It's one of her greatest songs. I love Wow. You feel down in life, put on Wow. Now pick you up. Wow's an amazing song. It's this pure musical joy. There's such joy that comes out of her voice. It's a gift to the world. I love it. But my favorite song on the album is actually Hammer Horror. Hammer Horror, yeah, the last track. And it's funky, rockin', and fun. And this is the thing, I'm a huge fan of Hammer Horror. I love Hammer Horror films. So I'm definitely the target audience for this song. I love them. Straight up British horror pimps, sitting around drawing rooms, drinking brandy, discussing monsters. I love those movies. I love the vibe. I like a lot of British stuff. Maybe I am a little bit of an Anglophile. And hey, Kate Bush is like the ultimate artist if you're an Anglophile. If you like British stuff, you'll like Kate Bush, right? I mean, because she's got songs like Oh England, My Lionheart, and Coffee Homeground. Doesn't get much more English than this. But Hammer Horror, love it. And I love how she sings the chorus. So over the top. Hammer Horror, Hammer Horror. Oh, I love it. That's the thing, too, why I love about Kate Bush. Kate Bush, imagine if there was this highly attractive young woman with big, beautiful mane of red hair, and she could dance, she could sing. She's gifted. She's a gifted, beautiful young woman. And she chooses to take this gift of hers to sing weird, crazy songs about Hammer horror movies. Wow, that sounds like an awesome person. And guess what? That awesome person really exists. It's Kate Bush. She really exists. And she really existed singing Hammer horror. I love this woman. Love this album. Underrated. But I think it probably should be the fourth album you listen to if you're getting into Kate Bush. Okay, so where do you go next? Where do you go? Because you're liking all this stuff. If you're liking all this stuff, you're going to like most of her albums. So you should definitely keep on going. And there's not that many, because short of the 70s and 80s, after that, she wasn't too prolific. She takes a big break. But we'll talk about that in a second. Hardcore Kate Bush fans will notice that I'm trying to steer people away from the dreaming. We'll get to the dreaming in a little bit, because I'm still steering away the newbies. Newbies, stay away from the dreaming. Do not go near the dreaming. You're not ready for it. You're not ready for it yet. I'd say, especially if you lean towards the poppy side, actually, if you're kind of a person that's into pop music, you probably should have hit this album a little sooner, maybe even. The Sensual World from 1989. This was her follow-up to Hounds of Love. I'll be honest, I'm not really crazy about this album. I like the title track, and I do like some songs from it, and it's a nice album to have playing over dinner, if you got a lady over. It's a sexy, nice pop album. That's how I would describe it. A sexy, erotic, vaguely mellow and exotic pop album, but it's definitely slicker and less eccentric compared to all her other albums, her previous albums. So it's more mainstream is what I'm getting at. If you're into mainstream pop music, then this probably should be your second album you get to after Hounds of Love. Her singing and the production is closest to that album. So you might like this album. You might like this album a lot. And it might be your second favorite Kate Bush album. Maybe even your favorite. But if you're coming into Kate Bush more as a new wave fan or a rock fan, I would definitely hit the albums the way I told you to hit the albums. And then come upon this album. Another album that's worth checking out too is Ariel from 2005. This was her big comeback album. Big comeback in England anyway. It was her big comeback album after going into retirement. You see, after the early 90s, she retired. She stopped making music and she just concentrated on bringing up her child and just living a nice kind of domestic life, and she kind of gave up music for a while. So in 2005, she came back with this album, Ariel. Now, Ariel, I think, is better than The Sensual World. And in fact, I think it's easily her best album after Hounds of Love. And it's a really, really good album. The first track, the single from the album, King of the Mountain, oh man, that's one of her best songs she ever did. I love King of the Mountain. So sexy and such a groove. I love King of the Mountain. Great song. And there's a lot of good stuff on it. Pie's a great song. How to Be Invisible. It's kind of like Hounds of Love, where the first half is kind of poppier and then the second half is more experimental. It's actually a double album. So when I say second half, I mean the second album. And the second album is pretty much all experimental, kind of ethereal, borders on new age kind of music. And at first I wasn't so crazy about it, but I've grown to like it. And this is another album that if you kind of lean a little poppier, this would be a good album for you to get to. It's not quite as edgy as some of her earlier stuff. And her singing's amazing on it. And it's amazing that after years of not making music, she came back with an album this strong. So I do recommend it. And now, by this point, if you got Hounds of Love and her first three albums, depending on your taste, your musical taste, you might be ready for this album, 1982's The Dreaming. Okay, now we're going to talk about The Dreaming. The Dreaming is now my third favorite Kate Bush album, and I love it. I think it's great. I think it's another masterpiece. It's very experimental. It is catchy, but not conventionally catchy. I think the best example of this is the first track, Sat in Your Lap. Now, when you first hear Sat in Your Lap, it takes you aback. It's like, whoa, what's this? But the more you listen to it, you kind of get into its strange hooks. And it is catchy. Just not in a traditional sense. And once you get into the groove of this album, it really opens up to you. And that's the thing. Some people might think, hey, should music be this much work? If I don't immediately like something, should I keep listening to it? It's a fair argument. But I will counter that some artists you should try again and again, just like any art, like Jean-Luc Godard back there, Pour Le Feu. There are certain artists, they're complicated, and there's a lot of layers to them, and you might just not be used to that kind of art. You just might not be used to hearing those kind of songs or watching those kind of movies, and as a result, your brain kind of reacts against it. But once you open your mind to it, it could be very rewarding. A lot of those artists, like Kate Bush, tend to be the most rewarding sometimes because there's so much going on in their music and there's so much depth and passion. I feel my life's enriched by listening to Kate Bush. So yeah, it was worth the effort. It was worth the effort because her music, with the exception of a couple of those songs, they weren't so accessible. It wasn't so easy. But once they opened up to me, it was magical. Yeah, that's right. God damn it, magical. I think she's a magical woman and she made magical music. And this album has this magic to it. It's just strange, it's experimental. David Bowie never did an album this experimental. So that should just give you an idea how out there it is. Like, I was already a big fan of his like Berlin period stuff he did with Brian Eno, and I still had trouble getting into this album. Like, to me, that stuff was much more accessible than this. But once I got into this album, I realized it was on the same level as those David Bowie, Brian Eno albums. I guess Hounds of Love, it's her ultimate album because she figured out a way to kind of bridge the accessibility of like Never Forever with the experimentation of this album. And that's why it's her best album. But if you just want to hear unhinged Kate Bush, like you're ready, you've been digging into it, you don't mind her little eccentric moments, and you have an open mind, then by all means, brothers and sisters, dive into this album and let it consume you. It's that kind of album. It's not an album you can listen to all the time. But when you do listen to it, it's going to totally consume you. And it totally consumed me. I love this album. It's great. It's also very British. It's kind of like the id of everything that Kate Bush has suggested. I should also bring up the fact that she's an amazing producer. A lot of people don't realize she also produced this stuff. She produced this album, and she produced her biggest album, Hounds of Love. And she's an amazing producer. And again, you have to go to artists like Bowie, Prince, Peter Gabriel, the Beatles. That's the level that she's working at. I think she's the greatest living female artist ever. Now you're starting to understand why I felt a need to make this video, and especially this week. Then we're going to get to 2 albums, and/or 3 albums, if you count one as an album, that I'm not really so crazy about. I pretty much have covered all the Kate Bush albums I love or like. Now we're getting to one album which I just think is all right, and that's her last album, 50 Words of Snow. It's a very nice album. That's how I describe it. I listen to it. It's very nice. It's very new age. It's kind of like the second side of Ariel, but even more so. It sounds like nice music that would be playing in a candle shop. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong walking around a candle shop every now and then. It's that kind of music. It's almost kind of like Christmas music in a way, too. I just listened to it again this morning, and I did like it a little bit more than before, but it's just a little too mellow and new age for me. So if that sounds good to you, then get it. But otherwise, it's definitely not one of the Kate Bush albums I would go to. I can respect it. I can hear its music of substance and quality and soul, but it's just not really my thing. And then we're going to get to what I think is her worst album, and most people agree with me, is The Red Shoes from 1993. And in fact, she might have felt the same way, because not only did she end up re-recording some of the songs, she gave up music after this for many years. So maybe she thought like she hit a brick wall. This continues in the path of the sensual world, where it's a little poppier, a little slicker, a little more mainstream, but it's not as good as that album. And that album I just thought was, I liked it. I thought it was good. This album straddles the line between average and actually bad in spots. Sorry, Kate, but yeah, I think Rubber Band Girl, which she re-recorded and did a better version later, but this version, oh, I did not like it. There's a few good tracks. And So Is Love is good. Features nice guitar work from Eric Clapton. There's a song she did with Prince, which actually I don't think is so hot. Constellation of the Heart's kind of all right. That's about it. I really don't like this album. It sounds like some of the stuff, this worst song she ever did is called Eatin' the Music, and it sounds like corny Caribbean cruise music. This is where she hit a brick wall, and obviously she felt the same thing, because she re-recorded this and some of the tracks from the sensual world. She re-recorded and released Director's Cut in 2011, the same year she did 50 Words of Snow, and it's all right. Some of the tracks, like, I do prefer the more rocking version of Rubber Band Girl is definitely an improvement, but I wouldn't say Flower of the Mountain is an improvement over the original The Sensual World. It's like a rethought version of that using James Joyce Texas lyrics. I prefer her original lyrics, and I prefer that original version of the song. So overall, I'm not really a huge fan of the Director's Cut too, but maybe it'll grow on me. So maybe these last 3 albums, maybe they'll grow on me. They're actually the only 3 albums of hers I don't own. I own all the other albums. Those 3 albums I just, I've sampled and listened to a few times on Spotify. But the other albums I own, and you should own them too. All the albums I recommended, excluding those last 3 that I was talking about, you should buy. But buy them in the order that I suggested, because it's important to not only support artists, but it's about ownership. When you just stream, if you're just streaming your albums, you don't necessarily have them, and anything can happen. There could be a change of copyright or some reason an artist protests having their music on Spotify. Like, you never know. There could be a reason why suddenly this music that you think is yours is gone and suddenly you don't have it. But when you actually own stuff, you own it. It's yours. It's on your hard drive. You don't even have to have a physical CD or a record. Just buy the stuff on iTunes, download it, and then you actually own music, and it's there for you whenever you want. Even if your Wi-Fi goes down, you got this music. So I highly recommend you actually buy these albums I talked about, and let's have a discussion about it. If you disagree, if you're Kate Bush fans and you think, oh, they should definitely go to the Kick Inside before Never Forever, let's talk about it. Let's talk about Kate Bush. I love that all these new fans are getting turned on to her in the same way I was getting turned on to her 2 years ago. So now it's like, hey, now we're all in the club. So we're all in the Kate Bush club. Let's talk about Kate. She's an amazing artist. I love her. And that's pretty much it. So there you go. That's my beginner's guide to Kate Bush, given to you from someone who was a beginner himself just 2 years ago. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you did enjoy this video, subscribe! I talk about a lot of music. Most of the music I talk about is like hard rock or heavy metal, but I have talked about different kinds of music as well. I talk about funk music and R&B sometimes. I even talked about a little bit of country. I talked about some pop. I've talked about like the Bee Gees and the Beatles and Prince. I did 2 videos about Prince. I do have fairly eclectic taste, so from time to time, you're going to get a lot of curveballs. Like this one. I'm sure a lot of the rocker bros that follow me were like, Kate Bush, But, all I can say is give her a chance. And this is to any of the metalheads and rockers. Not saying she's for everyone. Not saying she's necessarily for you. But there was a time where I couldn't get into Rob Halford. I thought his voice was too much, And now Judas Priest is one of my favorite bands. And Judas Priest was actually another band that helped me during the lockdowns. And I think a thing that Rob Halford and Kate Bush both have in common, not only are they both English, make great music, but there's a pageantry. And that's the thing, I've used this term a few times in my videos. I like music that has a pageantry to it. And that's the thing, Rob Halford, he sounds like a god coming down, and there's a regal quality to him. And Kate Bush, likewise, there's a regal quality to her, an earthy regalness. Like, not that she's like a royal or something, but it's like the earth gave her this nobility. She's a goddess, an earth goddess, and she has this regal way. She's like someone that you feel could have lived in the Arthurian times, except for she wouldn't have hooked up King Arthur or Sir Lancelot. She would have went right to Merlin. She would have had it off Merlin and learned his secrets, and then been dancing around the forest with elves and fairies and what have you. It's a pageantry, it's the same thing I love about Rob Halford and Ronnie James Dio and these artists that have magic to them. Stevie Nicks is like that too. I feel Stevie Nicks has a lot of pageantry and dark magic and witchiness. And Kate Bush has it in spades. So if any of this stuff sounds cool to you, then you might just be a Kate Bush fan. You might actually even be a diehard Kate Bush fan. So dive away, have fun, and I salute you.